This is a broadcast of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. This is Luke Saint. With me, I have my dad, Joel Saint, and also the infamous Mr. Dr. Peter Hammond. Welcome on to the show, Dr. Peter Hammond.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay. Now, we have some questions for you. A lot of controversy has led up to this point. We have the Future of Christendom conference this weekend, and now we're going to just ask you some questions about kinism, about Nazism, about all the things that everyone's been talking about, and hopefully gets your opinion on biblical things and hear your side of the story, which strangely, and not strangely I should say, has been absent for the last couple months. Like I said, it's not strangely. And so, Dad, you have some questions for Dr. Hammond. You want you to start first?
Yeah, my first question for Dr. Hammond would be this. I've got this from a fellow board member. And his question for Dr. Hammond is this. He would ask Dr. Hammond if he would comment on the racism of some of his detractors. Dr. Hammond's been attacked for racism, but some of his detractors themselves believe in things like white guilt. They believe in things like paying reparations to people that are a different color from you. So the question is, if Dr. Hammond could comment on that aspect of racism from his detractors, on the part of his detractors.
Well, certainly, I do not believe that salvation is by race. Salvation is by grace alone. And therefore, it's not biblical to expect people who didn't do the crime to pay reparations or restitution to people who weren't the victims. In the Bible, restitution is always direct and it's personal. The one responsible for whatever it was, a crime against property or life, is to do full restitution to the victim. And it's directly to them, not through some government or some international agency of the UN as a cover for corruption on a large deal. So, no, I don't believe you can declare an entire race guilty of anything, except in the sight of God, all men are sinners and are hell-deserving, wicked pagans deserving eternity in hell, all of us, but for the grace of God and for the atonement of Christ. So, obviously, I hold to the five solas. Scripture alone is the ultimate authority. Salvation is by the grace of God alone, received by faith alone. Everything must be done for the glory of God alone, and Christ alone is the head of the church. And He's the only way of salvation. I hesitated a few moments, but do bear in mind I've been in the air for the last 2 days, traveling from Cape Town, South Africa, via Europe. So I trust my brain will keep going despite the jet lag.
All right, fair enough.
My question concerning that is, this could be for both of you, but what do we do when, let's say, Dad, you steal from Dr. Hammond and you benefit from stealing from him, and then you die and I inherit the wealth that you give me, and then Dr. Hammond dies, and then his kids come to me and say, hey, listen, your dad stole from my dad. What do you think happens in that situation?
Yeah, you would say that you are benefiting from something that I took.
Yes.
Well, as a child, perhaps we could say that you are the victim. Here is the problem with this. And Thomas Sowell has done an awful lot of work on this and made this point again and again. Mm-hmm. For example, up until 1956, the black family was a lot stronger than the white family. Mm-hmm. I've been in the construction business, Luke, as you know. And you talk to old construction guys, and they will tell you that in this country, there used to be a lot of blacks that knew the trades, that knew how to work hard. The problems in the minority community, especially the blacks, are not as a result of slavery. Mm-hmm. There were years, generations, when their families were stronger, when they earned money. For example, I remember my mother. We were poor. We used to buy from the Fuller Brush salesman. And I'm telling you, we were so poor. We barely had 2 nickels to rub together. Mm-hmm. Fuller Brush was owned by a black man who was attacked by the civil rights group because he wouldn't come with his hand out. Mm. And so, and this is the problem. I will tell you this. I remember after your mom and I were married. I was just like 6 or 8 months we were married. We went to the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. And we were there. We had a Ford Pinto. We could hardly push down a hill, right? a black family, very attractive family in Mercedes-Benz came, and they asked us for change because they had a 20. They needed change for a 20. We didn't even have it, right?
Right.
They had so much more money. So I remember thinking, I don't know, should we have some kind of a law of equality here?
Right.
That I should have as much money as they do? Nonsense. If they earn the money, they can buy 20 Mercedes-Benz. It's none of my business. But see, now we have to come along and we got to say, oh well, these people are disadvantaged because they were their ancestors came over in boats or whatever. You know what? I got Muhammad Ali's quote for them. Thank God my ancestors got on that boat, because he went to Africa to look around. He saw what he saw. Like, oh my word! I'd much rather be in the U.S. And Thomas Sowell has said again and again, look, I might not be happy that my ancestors, how my ancestors got here, but I sure am glad they came.
So you're saying that the problem is an attitude adjustment? Is that? I mean, that doesn't fix injustice, though. I mean,
well, let's talk about justice here, and let's talk about reparations. Let's talk about the advantages that people of all kinds of color have because they're here. Let's talk about that, but that never gets talked about in this reparations. All the good that has happened to them and has been played, that never gets talked about. We just owe them money. Well, who you mean we? Who's we? It seems to be someone who, well, somebody else.
Yeah, and
you pay.
For Dr. Hammond in his country, is the only country where the majority of color gets affirmative action.
Well, yes, affirmative action was set up to help minorities, but not in Africa. In Africa, both Zimbabwe and South Africa, affirmative action helps the majority against the minority. And for example, in South Africa, we've got government interfering in the composition of our rugby teams, football teams, every team, cricket and so on, demanding a major amount of literally racial quotas. Now, imagine if America had, no, you can't have the American basketball team being almost all black. You've got to have only 12% black because they're only 12% of the population or whatever the stats is. Well, that's ridiculous. If the best basketball players in America happen to all be black, it doesn't matter if they're a racial minority. What's the problem? And in South Africa, black people don't like to play rugby. Rugby is a very, very rough, very English, Australian, South African type sport. And it just so happens that most of them happen to be Afrikaans whites. And so what? And yet our soccer team is almost entirely black. And so on. You can't look at a team and say, because it doesn't reflect the exact racial quotas. For example, my daughter's into ice skating. Well, not that many Africans are into ice skating. And she made the national team only because the government has no interference in it. Otherwise, if they put any money into it, they would have been determined that, well, a white person can't go. If you're too male, too pale, no chance. So as a Christian, we're not interested in racial quotas. To us, we're more concerned about the saved and the unsaved, those who are for Christ and those who are against Christ. So to me, race politics is a distraction. And if you look at what's going on in the world, just think of it, first of all, in thoughts of a pickpocket. If a person's trying to pick your pocket or steal a person's handbag or something, they need to distract you. Now, either they distract you while they're picking your pocket, or they've got a team member who's distracting you while they're getting the handbag or whatever. Now, governments and revolutionaries and movements, in order to loot countries, create revolutions, they need a lot of distractions. And the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. I think that's been well documented in Curtis Bauer's film Agenda, and Agenda 2, where he shows the masters of deceit use race politics, gender politics, and all other kind of politics as distractions while they bring about revolution. Their goal is to break down every aspect of your society. And they break down by distracting you into different issues. So, for example, the South African Communist Party, back in the 1920s, mobilized white miners under the slogan, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." And they caused race riots to stop blacks coming into jobs that had been reserved for whites in the mining. And later, the Southern Communist Party were pushing black politics against whites. See, they don't care about the blacks or the whites. They don't care about the men or the women. They don't care about the rich or the poor or the employers or the employees. None of that really matters because everyone ends up worse off under a socialist or communist government.
Right.
But they will use these these politics in order to distract people from the real issues, in order to mobilize the revolution, and they've got no problem turning from one side to taking the exact opposite position a little bit later on. The issue isn't the issue, it's the revolution. And as Christians, we shouldn't get caught up in race politics any of these other things, because you can see the people pushing it. They don't, for example, you know that you had a lot of pacifists in America who were campaigning to get America out of Vietnam. Now, I'm not saying that America should have had troops overseas in the first place, but the fact is the people who campaigned against America being involved in Vietnam said absolutely nothing for the poor Vietnamese who suffered under communism thereafter, or in Cambodia, or in Laos, and so on. And the people who were campaigning for justice and racial equality in South Africa, and boycotts on South Africa and so on, back when we were fighting communism while the Soviet Union was attacking us, we were fighting Cuban forces, Mechanized forces, huge wars, dogfights, aerial artillery bombardments, a massive conventional fight going on in Angola in the 1980s as the final hot part of the Cold War. And during that time, there were a lot of people campaigning to boycott South Africa, to disinvest South Africa, and so on. But the moment South Africa came under a South African Communist Party-controlled ANC, suddenly they lost interest. And it doesn't matter how many South Africans have gotten murdered and have suffered since, and how many South Africans are suffering and dying, the same people who were so concerned for justice back in the 80s are not concerned now. And so they said, you can't have racial quotas in the sports. And so they wouldn't allow South African rugby teams to play in Australia, New Zealand, and so on, because they were all white teams. Now that the teams have got to have certain quotas of blacks, now that they've got racial quotas and so on, is there no more concern for race politics now that the race politics are another way around? And people were saying they were concerned about terrible things done under apartheid. Well, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and chaired by none other than Desmond Tutu. And they determined that in the 44 years of apartheid in South Africa, during which we were heavily at war and so on, they came to about 500 people were killed by the apartheid government. 500. They admitted that at least 18,700 people were killed by the liberation movements, the guerrillas. Mostly black on black, as they would call it, so that you'd get the ANC terrorists killing in Carter Zulu Freedom Fighter Party and so on, and you'd get necklace murders of town councillors and black mayors being burned alive with necklace murders and so on. So at their own kangaroo courts that they held, like the Stalin show trials of the 1930s, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they admitted that the apartheid government was responsible for about 500 deaths in a 44-year war. And they accepted that the liberation movement had killed how many hundreds of times more, with 18,700. That's names, places, dates, and so on. Interesting. But since then, we've had 25,000 people murdered every year. So
wait a second. Whoa. In 44 years, you had 500 murders under apartheid.
But if you take everyone killed, normally they want to blame you even for the ones the terrorists killed. So let's say 8,700 people killed in 44 years war. Of course, most of those were killed by the terrorists. But versus 25,000 killed every single year.
Okay, so 8,700 killed in 44 years. Am I getting? I'm trying to get the math.
Yes.
In 44 years, and now in South Africa, the crime capital of the world, I think 25,000 per year.
They murder more people every year than died in 44 years of war.
Wow.
That's correct. And of those people that have been murdered since Mandela became president in 1994, 85,000 are whites, which is disproportionate considering we're only 9% of the population now. And of those, 4,000 are farmers and their family members. And when you think of how torturously many of them are murdered, we're talking about with blow tortures and tortured to death over periods of hours and days even, and how they target the older people and so on, and even babies, and just the cruelty of this. What you're dealing with is calls for genocide. Here we've got a government singing, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, kill the whites, kill all whites, posters, T-shirts, everything else, in Parliament. Government leaders, including the president, singing, kill them all, kill the whites, shoot to kill the whites, kill the farmer, one man, one farmer, one bullet, and so on. One church, one bomb, one minister, one bullet. I mean, these are songs sung by leaders of our country.
Mm-hmm.
And where's all the liberals concerned for fighting against injustice and racism in the country? Well, they're quiet because it's their people. It's communists running the country there, so they don't see any problem from the left. If Fidel Castro murders a bunch of Cubans, not a problem. Batista trying to defend his country from communism, that's a problem. The Shah of Iran, big problem. Ayatollah Khomeini, not a problem. Chiang Kai-shek, if people can think back that far, Second World, terrible, if he's defending his country from communists. Mao Zedong, 68 million people killed, not serious because he's a communist. Same thing with Stalin and so on. So what we're seeing is a continual pattern. Like my country that I grew up in, Rhodesia, we were attacked. We weren't allowed to be involved in the Olympics. We couldn't be involved in the Paralympic Olympics because we were fighting for our lives against communist terrorism. And nobody starved in Rhodesia, even while we were under sanctions, international sanctions, boycotts, and terrorism across 85% of our border. All of our border, except for one single railway line and one bridge, Bight Bridge with South Africa, was hot and with enemy activity, terrorists coming in, support by Red China and the Soviet Union. And we had a serious war, and we won all the battles. But when we allowed Kissinger peace talks to derail us into the one-man, one-vote elections, which led to Mugabe getting in power, now we've had 38 years of communist terrorism dominating Zimbabwe, where people are dying of starvation. More than half the population has fled. The worst inflation on the planet ever. Worse than Yugoslavia, Weimar Republic. Billions of a percent inflation a year, where $100 trillion note couldn't buy half a loaf of bread.
Wow.
$100 trillion note. And that's after they dropped 16 zeros off. So Zimbabwe, but who's concerned about Zimbabwe, which is Jimmy Carter's foreign policy legacy? And of course, they've got affirmative action, and they took all the farms from whites. 5,600 commercial farms were taken away from the farmers without compensation just because they were white. Now, we've got the Southern government wanting to do the same. And you've got a whole bunch of people singing their praises, like Theresa May, Prime Minister of England, coming and toy dancing with the president who's saying he wants to do this, and offering millions of British pounds to help them in this aim. Now, that is supporting a racist, communist agenda of economic suicide, and where the social justice warriors on the genocide's going on. In my country right now, our people are being targeted and murdered and attacked all the time, every single day. We're hearing horror stories of people killed. And so we're living in, and well, Joel, you've been there. You know the situation, what we're living under.
Well, while I was there was an attack on a farm. While I was there, visiting you last year. And
close by, yes.
In October, and attack on farm with murders going on there. Yeah, and clearly they're trying to make South Africa ungovernable. Right, and that way that's what they do, right? You create the chaos, and then everybody's more open to the strong man. Just get rid of the chaos. Whatever you do, we'll embrace the chains and slavery. It's okay. Right. We just want to be done with the chaos. Well, and that's what they do. Yeah. Peter brings up a point that I want to address. Peter has come under attack for appearing on some podcast broadcast.
Yeah, I was going to ask him about that.
Yeah, and well, go ahead and ask your question, then I'll follow up.
I asked you this question earlier, Peter, but if you could just answer it again, I'd appreciate it. You appeared on that neo-Nazi radio show. And
I'm sure I've appeared on many.
Yes, right.
Because, well, I'm a missionary, and I've been a missionary for over 38 years. And in the course of that work, I've been on some of the most radical Islamist terrorist stations, where I walk into the station, like Radio 786, which is a radical Muslim radio station, Athlone, Cape Town, and they've got Hamas, Hezbollah, Intifada, death to Israel, one Jew, one bullet, and so on. Well, why have people not complained about me going on this Muslim radio station? Next thing you say, why are you going on a Muslim radio station that's calling for genocide of the Jews? Because I'm a missionary. Mm-hmm. They invite me to speak on pornography, against blasphemy, against gambling and abortion. Okay, although Islam's one of our biggest enemies, even a stop clock is right twice a day. Yes. We find ourselves on the same side as our enemies on some issues. And so we've even had Muslims joining us for some of our marches to Parliament against abortion and gambling and pornography. So, yes, I've been on the radio stations, even though I've written books against Islamic terrorism and slavery. As a Christian, I've spoken in Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Roman Catholic, and many. I've been in Muslim terrorist bases. I've been communist terrorist camps. I've shown the Jesus film in communist terrorist bases. I've been ministering to SWAPO, ANC, FALIMO, PAC, ANC. Gee, I even come to America. I minister all over America. Just because I minister in America doesn't mean I support your foreign policy, doesn't mean I support abortion of babies.
Yes.
It doesn't mean I support saturation bombing of civilian centers or Tomahawk missiles being sent into suburbs in Syria. Just because I minister in America doesn't mean I support everything you stand for. And just because I speak in a Presbyterian church doesn't mean I support infant baptism. And if if neo-Nazis ask me to speak on a radio station, I wouldn't hesitate for a moment. They need the gospel too. And I oppose socialism. I oppose all socialism.
Did you give the gospel in that presentation?
I've been on their radio stations many times, and I've certainly brought in scriptures, biblical arguments, historical, and the gospel. Maybe not every single radio program would have a full gospel presentation, but I'm having influence and I'm reaching them. Now, why would they invite me? Because I've written against Islam, terrorism, communism. I've been in prison with both communists and Muslims, and I've been tortured for my faith. And so it's funny that I get some of the most Zionist radio stations having me on, and I get some of the most anti-Zionist stations. Why? Well, there's some interconnection because I'm speaking out against radical Islamic terrorism, and both sides would find a reason to have me on. That doesn't mean they agree with everything I stand for either. And so, as a missionary, I don't have to stop and do a value judgment. Do I accept this or don't I? I accept every single invitation.
Well, I want to jump in here and thank you for something, Peter, because you actually brought something to my attention a few years ago, which I should have seen. It was right in front of my face, and that's Hollywood here, because we have a real problem. We have a real problem with the National Socialists, but we have no problem whatsoever, it appears, with the International Socialists.
Yeah.
Now think about it.
Yeah.
National Socialists might be a problem, but we all get excited when a couple of skinheads have a march in Nashville, Tennessee. But we're not worried at all about the communist city council, school board presidents. In other words, we're worried. It seems to me we're worried about the Nazis. I mean, really, is anybody worried about the Nazis taking over anytime soon?
Not since 1945.
Yeah, communists. They're like everywhere.
Yeah.
But what Peter pointed out to me here years ago, which I should have thought of, is that Hollywood is phenomenal at making anti-national socialist movies, Nazi movies. They have them all the time.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Just
came out with one.
Yeah. The latest one.
Yes.
What is that called? Oh man, I can't remember which
journey, the mission, the
yes.
mark or something. I forget what it is. It's about the guy who went off to South America and they found him later.
Oh yeah. Eichmann. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I happen to have read the book.
Yeah.
Eichmann in my hands. Anyway, the book was written a while ago. Anyway, at least that's one of the books that was written about. Anyway, where are the Hollywood movies against international socialism?
The Gulag Archipelago,
Yes.
the Great Cultural Revolution, the Holodomor in Ukraine,
Yes.
All the different Soviet and Red Chinese atrocities. We had one film once about the killing fields of Cambodia, but that was blamed on the Americans because, first of all, you shouldn't have been there and then you shouldn't have left, which is, I thought, a bit of an argument against itself. But I mean, they only made it because they tried to blame America for what the communist Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. But aside from the killing fields, can you think of any other major film made on communist atrocities? Which
Enemy
at
at
one
the
point
Gates would be
controlled
the
a third of the
closest
world.
one.
Yeah, Enemy
Enemy
at the Gates would be the closest one. Yeah, that was a major release.
Even Dr. Zhivago.
Sorry, Enemy at the Gates was pro-Soviet.
I'm saying that's like I'm just talking about ones that were like in that time period. Actually, Dr. Zhivago was a little more against it.
Well, I want to talk about Enemy of the Gates for a second because I think
that was a pro-Soviet film.
I don't think it was, Peter. The reason why I'm saying that is at the end of it, there's an argument made by one of the guys who's saying, you know what, you cannot legislate equality. Some people are better at some things, some people are worse at other things. I thought the movie itself really, if we're thinking about the same one, really slammed
Battle
communism.
of Stalingrad, I must have... There's a film, Enemy at the Gates is Battle of Stalingrad.
How long ago was the
From a
movie
cer-
made?
Jude Law, that was like 15 years ago.
Sounds
So-
about
15,
right.
20 years ago.
Does that sounds about right? We have the same one.
About the snipers.
Uh,
the sniper. The
yes,
Germans
it was
versus
about
it was the
snipers. Yeah,
Germans
that's what
versus
it
the
was.
Russians. Yeah.
That's
The
what it was.
perspective is from such as Red Army propaganda. Highly unlikely that it's even a true story. It was a
Yeah.
propaganda story. But anyway, that was hardly anti-communist.
Well,
right. Well, for
it
every
was
for
pretty-
every
it was pretty
even
small.
remote
Yeah.
anti-communist movie out there,
Remote.
there's 100 anti-Nazi.
Oh, if not 1,000.
Yes, and another thing I want to say is a lot of Americans, what they I want to ask you another question here, Peter, about this. A lot of Americans, they think Germans are Nazis and Nazis are Germans. They think they're synonymous. And another thing is, what are your thoughts on Hitler? Like, because people are like, oh, he's on that show. He's a Hitler sympathizer. They've been calling you a Hitler sympathizer.
Well, I've been on shows with people who are Muhammad sympathizers. That doesn't mean I agree with them.
Right.
I'm a missionary. I mean, people must realize I'm not a political candidate. I'm not a monk. I'm a missionary. Our job is to take the gospel to all the world, to preach the gospel to every creature, to get into every level of society. And so, as a Christian missionary, my standard is biblical. My great ambition is the Great Commission.
Yes.
That's my supreme ambition. And everything I do is focused on fulfilling the Great Commission, making disciples, teaching obedience to all things the Lord has commanded. Now, I've got a great interest in history. I use history to proclaim the gospel and biblical principles and providential history. Now, in the course of it, because I specialize in serving persecuted churches and helping Christians in the areas where they are being persecuted by communists or Muslims, obviously to understand the history behind it and to expose so that we don't fall for these traps again, it's been important for me to understand how they work. As a result of some of the books I've written, history books like Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, I get invitations from both spectrums. There's a lot of Jewish, Zionist, pro-Israel groups who use me for radio programs and meetings on Islam. And there's a lot of the National Socialist type groups and Euro type groups which are very much trying to oppose the Islamic invasion to Europe, who also want to use me for that because we coincide in our agreement on that one issue. But if we were to start talking about a whole lot of other issues, I know that those folks would say, oh, well, but we do need abortion to get rid of the human weeds and, the eugenics of Margaret Sanger and so on. So, look, obviously, Adolf Hitler was a National Socialist. He came from a humanistic perspective. I have spent my Christian life for the last 41 years preaching against secular humanism, preaching against socialism, preaching against abortion, eugenics, euthanasia, and all these other aspects, including totalitarianism, statism. We believe in total decentralization. The books I've written, like Biblical Principles for Africa, South Africa Renaissance or Reformation, go straight for these kind of socialist and these totalitarian, centralized systems. Doubtless, if I was around in Germany in 1930s, I would have had a prison ministry because they wouldn't have liked these sort of things. You take a person like the famous Bonhoeffer, goodness me,
Dietrich
jet lags.
Bonhoeffer,
Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had a weekly radio program. 1 week into February 1933, he's on his first radio program after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. And so he has, of course, been critical in discussing it. During his radio program, the first week goes dead, music comes on, he walks into the hallway, what's happened? Your program's been cancelled. I mean, that's how efficient they were. They really were efficient. And his voice was silenced on radio. Now, I'm in a communist country. I fought the communists in the South African Defence Force. I still fight them using the pen and publications and meetings and so on. I'm very vocal. I've marched the largest protest ever seen in South Africa against our government, 30,000 strong, to Mandela's offices, protesting against paganization of a country, abortion, pornography. And I'm still doing radio programs there, although they've pushed me off some different radio stations and off national TV, but which I used to get on. But nevertheless, thank the Lord, because of social media and community radio stations, we're still having a voice there. Our communist enemies are not as efficient as the National Socialists were in Germany. I'm sure that I would not still have a voice if we had an efficient enemy like them.
Yes.
But so obviously I don't support any dictators. But if I attack Stalin, that doesn't mean I'm supporting Hitler. If I attack communism, it doesn't mean I'm supporting Nazism. We attack all socialism, all secular humanism, all centralization, all totalitarianism. Because I may criticize America's foreign adventurism and America getting involved in toppling governments overseas like in Iraq or in Libya, or it doesn't mean I support Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. I'm saying that you should have a policy like that of Switzerland, armed neutrality, where you will follow the instructions of your first president. George Washington said, avoid entangling alliances and do not get involved in Europe's wars. Now, if I think that's a good policy, and if I say you wouldn't be having terrorism or virtual strip searches at your airports today if you weren't involved in toppling governments and causing grief in the Middle East. The wars that you've got involved in there have brought terrorism to your shores and has stripped you a lot of your liberties. Now, does that make me anti-American, to quote your first president, George Washington's policies, or try and have you to be true to your constitution, or to say we should learn from the oldest republic in the world, Switzerland, or from biblical principles? But the way many people want to frame discussions these days is in the terms of the radical, hysterical leftists on the university campuses, who are often guided by the Communist Party or USA, or by Hollywood, who's full of blasphemy and antichrist prejudice. Why should we allow our freedom of speech and our freedom of thought and our freedom of conscience to be so narrowly defined that the moment you attack one thing, they want to stereotype you into something and label you? Just because I oppose pornography and Hollywood's blasphemies doesn't make me anti-Semitic. Just because I oppose communism and Islam doesn't make me Islamophobic or a Nazi. And it's just outrageous how people can want you to be guilty by association. And for a missionary, that's not really fair, because I could understand if people were questioning, why do you go into communist terrorist camps and Muslim jihadist radio stations in order to be there? Because I'm a missionary. That's what we do. We take the gospel to the people who need it. And you can't tell me Islamic jihadists don't need the gospel. Just like Zionist people, just like Nazis, they all need the gospel. And what I'd like people to do is evaluate me on our books, our sermons, our publications, our newsletters, our work, what we have devoted our life to, but to try and have you guilty by association because somebody who interviewed you also had this guest who said that. Well, I don't have the time to even investigate that. And even if I knew they had the worst people on the planet on the program before or after me, I would still accept the invitation to go and minister.
Dad?
I'd like to switch gears here a little bit and talk about something that has been a topic here, and that is the so-called excommunication of Peter Hammond by the Church of Christian Liberty back in the year apparently 2003. I have access to the church documents. I've been amazed at what I found, and frankly even more amazed at what I haven't found. What I'm intrigued by, and I'm going to ask for your comment on this, Dr. Hammond. What I've been intrigued by is a couple of things. First of all, as long as I've known you, you've been a Baptist. This is a Presbyterian church, after all. That's the first thing. Second thing is I've looked through the documents, and there is no statement of excommunication. There is no statement by the court documents. I've looked through them. There's 72 pages or 74, I forget how much, that come out electronically on my screen. There's no statement of excommunication whatsoever. There's no declaration. There's no declaration of what the court findings are. There's no declaration of what the charges are. Or what the official charges are. There are charges. There's so-called evidence brought, but there's no documented excommunication. So I've concluded there's no. Everybody's saying there's excommunication. There's no statement of excommunication. If you came out of a courthouse, Luke, and
A verdict.
yeah, well, and everybody says, oh, Luke, Luke, he's got the death penalty for it. He's going to the chair. Well, not the chair anymore. Right. But we're going to do it humanely. We're going to inject him with whatever.
Right.
Okay. And everybody said, He got convicted of murder or whatever. Right. He's going to die. Right. And then we go back and we look at court and no one can find a document that you were convicted. Wouldn't we say that you weren't convicted?
Right.
Well, we don't have a document that Peter was excommunicated. So I'm saying he was not excommunicated. That aside from the problems in the documents.
Well, let's
themselves.
talk about some of the problems in that document.
I want to address that. First of all, there is supposed to be, there's so many there. First of all, there's a charge of adultery. We get it secondhand from a redacted paper from a woman whose name we don't even know. We don't have her testimony at all. We have the testimony of someone who said they talked to her. Mm-hmm. Now, we know even anybody who's a student of God's law at all knows you don't convict anybody on one
hearsay.
Witness. Yeah, and this is hearsay. This isn't even it's worse than one witness, Luke. It's no witnesses. It's pure hearsay. That's one thing. We also have this so-called statement from Jan Breitenbach there. There is no date on it.
Yeah, I think you're friends with Dr. Hammond?
Yeah, very much friends with him. Been in his home just recently. We've done missions in the field for up to a month at a time. Still good friends, honestly. Look,
yeah,
we can pick everything to pieces bit by bit quite easily.
Yeah, all right. If I would pick it apart, it would take me the next hour, and we don't have time.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I could try and do it fairly shortly. I'm not an American. I've never been an American. I've never lived in America. I don't see how any American church could excommunicate me, considering I've always lived in Africa and based in South Africa since leaving Rhodesia. So as long as I've been a Christian, my home church have always been in Cape Town, and I've been a Baptist. And so I'm not sure how a Presbyterian church in Illinois has jurisdiction over a Christian missionary in Africa. They can choose to drop their support for anyone, of course, that's their entitlement. But I don't see where they get the right to excommunicate someone for. And I was never told I was in a church court. I've got no concept of a church court. I'd never heard of a church court before because I'm not a Presbyterian. I had no idea that I was in a court proceeding. They never told me that these are charges or this is a court. I was never given any result or finding. They never told me what the decision was. They said I'd hear, and next thing I discovered from James Kennedy, I went straight from Illinois down to Fort Lauderdale. They knew that was my next stop. I was regularly a guest of James Kennedy, who's on our board and one of our best supporters. And so James Kennedy picked up these papers and said, "Did you know you've just been a church court?" I said, "No." And he said, "I didn't think you'd know that that's a very Presbyterian thing." He said, "Who's this Church of Christian Liberty?" And I said a few things that I've never heard of them. And he took the papers, Dr. James Kennedy, dropped them in the bin next to his desk, and walked me up to Truths That Transform, his radio program, and continued. Now I was in his pulpit, and he continued to support us to his dying day. And so from 2003, he's the first to receive this. The first person I heard of this decision from came specifically from James Kennedy. And he just, as a Presbyterian, he laughed it off and threw it away. Well, when you think about the fact that not one of these people on the board there were 5 elders at the time. There's only 2 of those original ones now, because within a very short while they excommunicate the other a couple, or they left and fell apart.
Wait a minute, some of the people that excommunicated you were so-called excommunicated.
Well. That's correct. It's a very divisive little group. Now, when they call themselves Presbyterian, James Kennedy laughed at that because he says, well, you can't be Presbyterian if you're not in a synod. You've got to be in fellowship with other Presbyterian churches to call yourself Presbyterian. And so being a synod of one with no higher authority to appeal to, answerable to themselves, effectively 2 elders. The founder of the Church of Christian Liberty, Dr. Paul Lindstrom, is a good friend and supporter and member of our board. And he warned me before he died. He said, watch out for these 2 specific elders. He says, they want your guts. They've got it out for you. They want to get you. He said, watch your back. And Paul Lindstrom died the year before this attack. So the very next opportunity they had for me coming around, they asked me. So I even said to them at the time when they were asking all these questions, and they seem to have a very simple procedure. Any dirt on Peter Hammond, it doesn't matter what the source, they accepted. People I'd kicked out of our mission or disciplined for having pornography on their computers, or for theft, or for deceit, or whatever the different reasons were, laziness and so on. Whatever they said against me, even if they didn't say it directly, but someone else had heard, and second, third, fourth, fifth hand, a lot of the charges came straight from the publisher of Hustler magazine, which is a pornographic magazine, who said that he is going to put 100,000 rand, back when a rand was close to $1, into detectives to find all the dirt in my closet. And Charles van Wyk heard him giving that threat and said, well, go ahead, you're welcome. And he later came out with a front cover of Hustler magazine, Peter Hammond, blue-eyed Bible smuggler, blue-eyed gun runner. So the best he could come out with was that I smuggled guns to the anti-communist freedom fighters of Renamo in Mozambique and Junita in Angola, which if I had done wouldn't actually be a crime in my mind, but I'd actually only smuggled Bibles. But I suppose this chap didn't think that was a good enough story. Well, anyway, so taking Hustler People's attacks, the government of Sudan's slander spread against me, and so on and so forth, they put every single negative thing, everything positive was discounted, everything negative was accepted. No due process, no opportunity for me to even know the sources of many of these accusations. And I got the impression we were sitting around a table and they were asking me to give an answer, and I could see after a while they didn't care what I had to say. They were just throwing everything negative. And I thought, this is bad. And I said at one point, why are you doing this? And as one elder said, you're the most popular missionary in our church. We can't just drop your support. So they felt they had to do something more.
Wow.
Interesting. Now, the fact that I was even given an affiliated membership of that church was done by Paul Lindstrom on the basis of when South Africa fell under the communists in 1994. He said, Peter, I'm giving you an affiliate membership so that if the communists arrest you, we can intercede on your behalf. So Paul Lindstrom had offered me an affiliate membership of their church. Not that I fully understood what that meant, was to speak up for us if we got into trouble, considering I had no intention to leave. And he was asking me to leave. Dr. R.J. Rashduni was asking me to come over to Valesato in California. He'd cover all the costs, want me to make that the base for Frontline Fellowship. They were all concerned for my safety, to stay in a country which is now in the hands of people we had fought, communists, anti-Christians. And I said I had no peace to go. The Lord had not led me to leave. I need to stay, no matter what the threats. Paul Lindstrom would have been horrified to think that his elders took his church and the name of the church he founded, Church of Christian Liberty, to attack a ministry he so passionately supported. In fact, every single ministry and mission which Paul Lindstrom supported got chopped and axed within the next year or so after he died. So those elders had a different agenda, and they were against me, I'm told, for very different reasons. I was told by Paul Lindstrom, the founder, that it was primarily because of my stand on animal rights, because I'm an avid anti-candline hunting, anti-poaching and so on, and these people were avid hunters. Not that I've ever spoken against normal hunters. I've spoken against poaching and ivory hunting and trophy hunting and candline hunting, which I think any decent hunter should oppose as well. But nevertheless, they were so furious. He said they wanted to excommunicate me on my position on animals before at a church meeting, and Paul Lindstrom had laughed and said, you can't do that because there's no church council that says you've got to hold this or that position opposite from one. He said, this hasn't been dealt with in any church council, so no, you can't call it heresy and you can't excommunicate someone for what he believes on animals or how he applies the creation mandate. So he said, they will not let this go. When I'm gone, they're going to come for you. And they did. So the attacks are ludicrous. The jurisdiction, they don't have any. And the procedure that went through, well, it certainly was never explained to me. But more than that, there never was an attempt at council. Not one of those 5 elders at that time, although there are only 2 of them left now, ever tried to counsel me, communicate with me, personally pray with me. None of them ever did. If they thought that I was in error, surely the first thing you should do is try and counsel a person correctly.
Yeah.
Excommunication is not meant to be your first recourse, meant to be the last. And then I've noticed that it doesn't seem that any reformer has escaped being excommunicated, from Jan Hus and Wycliffe through Luther, all the way through. Yes. They all get excommunicated. Even in recent times, R.J. Rashduni, Gray Meshon, Greg Bunsen, I mean, you can name anybody who has tried to reform the church gets excommunicated, whereas plain reprobates like Bill Clinton don't get excommunicated.
Wait, and I have just one more question about that, then we need to move on. But
last one we'll talk about will be kinism.
Okay, I want to talk about South Africa a little bit too, if we can here, Luke. I don't know what kind of time we have left here. But
as much time as
we want.
as we
Okay.
have. Yeah.
I want to establish just one thing about this and then move on. My understanding in that so-called excommunication proceeding, that so-called court, is that you never ever had the chance of the opportunity to cross-examine even one primary witness.
Not one. There was no witness there. We just had accusations.
Written accusations.
Yes,
Okay.
I presume so. But I was never given access to even the sources of many of these accusations. And in fact, I'm not even sure what they're talking about with a lot of the accusations, because I don't see where they can come up with some of these elaborate charges from. Because when accusations were first made against me, I offered my resignation to our board, and they refused. And I offered it also to Unite Christian Action, which later became Christian Action Network, on a number of occasions, saying, as I'm under controversy, it's probably better someone else. They never accepted it. I remember at one time, Charles van Wyk chaired the committee that did a whole lot of investigations with primary witnesses, sworn affidavits from as far afield as Sudan and so on, refuting these statements. I know several groups, including my father-in-law's mission, did an investigation. I know that the church in Sudan, Episcopal Church Sudan, with two bishops put together, refuting these, Bishop Bulindule particularly, refuting the Sudan-relevant ones. We had people in Zambia also refuting a lot of the accusations from the field. So there were so many that at a certain point, Scholl declared enough already. We've thoroughly exhausted. We've shown that all they're doing is every time we prove these 6 charges false, then they don't admit that. They just come up with a new charge. And so shifting goalposts, I think America should know how this character assassination works. If you've got a pro-life judge, suddenly people dig out something from 35 years ago, and it's not that the people digging it up care about morals. I mean, these are the people promoting everything from blasphemy to pornography, but suddenly they act like they're concerned that some lewd act might have been done 35 or 40 years ago by this person who wants to stop the killing of babies. What it really comes down to is they don't care how much immorality goes on, because they're always pushing it, especially in the movies and in their laws. But what they care about is to continue killing babies. And if you've got a pro-life judge who's opposing that, then they're going to try and dig up dirt on them, whether it's real or imagined or manufactured. And in my case, I don't think the issue is that these people care about any of these issues either. Why would an American church care about what's happening in Africa anyway? But we are the most prominent pro-life group in South Africa. We're the most prominent anti-communist group in South Africa, and we're the most prominent supporter of persecuted churches in Africa, and therefore in exposing communism and Islam and persecution. And I wonder if all these other things are smokescreen, and the real issue is to try and silence an enemy of the New World Order.
It's a good question.
Yeah, well, I mean, that pretty much covers. I mean, that's that instance of this church court, this excommunication sounds more like something that I think our listeners are fighting all the time, and that is ecclesiastical tyranny. You know, that's what that sounds like to me. You'd think they'd be jumping all over that.
You would think that. Apparently their opposition to ecclesiastical tyranny is rather selective.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. I mean, for me. But going on to probably the most controversial of all these topics that we've been talking about, obviously, is kinism. And I talked with you about this earlier. And, obviously, I told a lot of people I'd ask you this question, because I have friends with mixed marriage, I have friends that have mixed marriages, and I told them, I said, I'd ask you this question.
In our own case, maybe we have a mixed marriage in our family.
Yeah, in my family.
Our daughter, Luke's sister, is married to a young Arab man.
Arab.
Yeah. He calls himself Arab. I think he's Southern European.
Yeah.
Whatever. He thinks he's Arab.
Yeah, anyway,
whatever.
Obviously, and I'm dating a Brazilian. But here's the thing. Surprise, surprise, Dr. Hammond also has many friends who are in mixed marriage relationships. The question is...
No way.
Yeah.
No way. He hates anyone who is involved in a mixed marriage.
Yeah, clearly. So the question is, I mean, is it wrong to marry outside the color line? And how do you treat those, what is your stance on those relationships that do marry outside the color line?
Well, these people are outside of my jurisdiction. I have no right to be telling people outside of my family, outside of my congregation, outside of our mission, what they should be doing on counselling issues. If people ask my counsel, I'll give them my counsel as best I know how. But I'm based in Africa. I live in South Africa. I live in a country which is dominated by communists who hate me. I risk my life every day throughout Africa. And for the 37 years I've been running Frontline Fellowship, I was involved in missions before. I worked for Hospital Christian Fellowship before starting Frontline. So my missionary work goes back longer than these 37 years with Frontline. I've dedicated the vast majority of my life to working in restricted access areas, communist and Muslim areas, mostly throughout Africa, working as far north as Sudan, as far over to the west as Nigeria, helping black Christians who are being persecuted for their faith. And so when I tell my many African friends that Americans are wanting people to boycott this conference, for example, because Peter Hammond's a racist, all my black friends just laugh. I mean, they think it's hysterical because, as many of them said, many of these black African friends of mine say, we don't have a better friend. I mean, who's doing more for us? In fact, as one person said, who's Joel McDermott? What has he ever done for Africa? And I said, well, I don't even think he's visited Africa. So, I mean, they just scorn us and laugh it out of court. I don't know what the average American is thinking. Your country is probably the most propagandized and politicized country on the planet, and very divisive too. So in Africa, let me tell you the way we look at it. We're fighting for our lives against communism, Islam, and secular humanism, and witchcraft. I mean, Africa's a continent conflict. So to us, when we find someone willing to suffer and die for Christ, he's a brother or sister in Christ. And that includes the Coptic Christians in Egypt, the Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, who've suffered a lot for centuries, standing up for the faith.
Yes.
Whether I find, we work a lot amongst Episcopalians, Baptists, Independents, Charismatics, vast groups, everything from Zionists onwards. So when we find people who love Christ, we work with them, we serve them. And so, yes, in the course of our work, I'm working amongst people very, very, very tribal. I don't think Americans can understand how tribal Africa is. In Africa, it's super important that you're Dinka or Nuer or Moro or Zulu or Xhosa, Xhosa, as we would say.
Yes.
Each tribe is very, very, very important. And okay, I was brought up in Rhodesia, and obviously, while we were good neighbors to all those around us, we were very concerned to be faithful to our own tribe. And so, in Africa, marrying within your tribe is extremely important, very important. I must say, I was distressed when my daughter told me that an American was wanting to approach me to ask for her hand in marriage. I'm not anti-American. I mean, my wife is technically American, even though she was born in Europe and raised in Austria. But her parents are American, from Georgia and Tennessee. I didn't want my daughters marrying an American. And let me tell you, it's not because I'm anti-American. It's because I love my country, and I don't like the amount of South Africans who want to run away from our problems, become Americans or Australians or whatever. I don't believe in running away from our problems. So the fact that I love my country more doesn't mean that I am against you. I expect you to love your country. And I expect the Sudanese and the Congolese to love the country, and that's why I serve them. So the fact that we in Africa are more tribal, I don't know that the people in America understand that. That doesn't mean you're against the people of other races. Or, for example, I minister in Presbyterian and Episcopal churches. I don't agree with them on a whole range of church government or modes of baptism and so on. But I would never be rude. I'd never be impolite. I'd never preach against their doctrines from their pulpit. That would be violating hospitality. So we believe in being good neighbors. But the fact that I would like my children to marry within our tribe, it doesn't mean that I've mistreated my American son-in-law. In fact, he's much beloved, and so yes, I have been in many people's homes who involved in mixed marriages. There's many of our colleagues and co-workers who have been as well, and I trust that none of them could say I've ever been rude or anything but thoughtful, considerate, and helpful and loving Christian neighbor and co-worker. But as a Christian involved in serving persecuted churches, and doing research on how communism works, I cannot help but notice the plan of communists to promote globalization and miscegenation and mass immigration and open borders for the goal of diluting especially the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants,
Right.
and to create a situation of basically revolution to destroy your country. Now, it is a fact. I know it because I've been on their websites and I've checked the documents. The Communist Party USA from the very beginning has had promoting miscegenation as a major goal to break down America's security. And so in South Africa, we've seen that as well. The Communist Party South Africa, which is the second oldest communist party in the world, has got this as well. Now, I can see, ideally, biblically, it's ideal to marry within your race and within your culture and tribe even. And this doesn't mean I'm going to judge other people. It doesn't mean I'd ever be rude to any of them. It means that I'm looking at this ideally, and I can see we've reached a situation where the national security of the United States of America is threatened because of, for example, well, can I just mention one name? Barack Hussein Obama, who hated his mother because she is white, who said how embarrassed he was and how he hated that part of him which was white and which identified only with his Muslim father, who never brought him up and didn't care about him anyway. Interesting that you could have somebody who could be president of America who said if there ever was a contest between Islam and America, he'd take the side of Islam. And he put that in his own books. So we can see there is a danger in at least some of radicalizing people of mixed race and trying to create a disloyalty. And these people, of course, I'm talking about the communists, don't care about the individuals and the families and the lives and the cultures being affected. They're just trying to promote revolution. So, of course, there could be people, very loving, dedicated Christian people who, for various reasons, are married across racial and tribal and cultural lines, and God bless them, and may they make the best that they can. When I'm talking ideally, and myself and the counsel I may give someone who comes to me for advice, that is not me pronouncing judgment on others. I'm a missionary to Africa, working primarily amongst black people in Africa. I think that should speak for itself on where I stand. But the fact that I've done enough research to understand what the communist New World Order agenda is, and it's made me look again at the scriptures and see Abraham's instruction to a servant about the kind of daughter-in-law he wanted for his son, and the instructions all the way through, and what Ezra says and what Nehemiah says, Ezra 9 and Nehemiah 9. I can plainly see that God made the different races for good purposes. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. And certainly it's God's general plan. And for most of church history, people have married within their race and culture. So that would seem to be ideal. The people promoting it, and remember, the people promoting, especially with Hollywood and the advertisers and so on, in many cases don't love your country, don't love Christ, promote blasphemy. So I'm saying it's one thing if people are led by the Lord to a marriage. It's another thing if it's the culture pushing it on you.
Okay. Dad, your thoughts?
Yes. I had a good friend of mine say something similar. He said, look, I'm Presbyterian. And he said, I don't have anything against the Baptists, but I'm strongly Presbyterian, and I'd be very disappointed, and it would discourage my daughter from marrying a Baptist, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm a Baptist, right? Am I supposed to get all offended by this now? Oh, well, now he hates Baptists. No, he doesn't hate Baptists, but he does love Presbyterians. Wants his grandchildren be brought up as Presbyterians. Are we gonna throw him under the bus for this?
Right.
Absolutely not. And then the whole race thing is a lot more complicated, I think, than what people want to make it. I don't know why God created the separate races. I would like to know that. Maybe someday I will. But it is a fair question. It's a fair question to be debated. And in our social justice warrior questions circles, you're not allowed to debate it. But can we not at some point say that if God in his providence wanted there to be separate races, that he might have had a reason, and before we go all SJW over everything, we should at least attempt to ask and answer that question.
Well, I've noticed that they've got all kinds of ways of stopping you from debating things. And of course, the main thing is name calling and toxic labeling, that you are racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semite, Nazi, if you dare consider even the possibility of anything other than. And so you've got to, it's like a new Inquisition, where you've got to hold to these things, or we're going to burn you at the stake of public opinion.
Shoot on sight. And you know, growing up, right? Because you kids, when you're little, you say, "Hey, Dad, you know, what if we married someone from another race?"
Yeah.
You know, you kids would ask me that growing up, right? And we would have that discussion.
It's too late for that now.
Yeah, a little late, in most cases. But my response was, look, let's just say for my daughter, there's two men left on the earth. Okay, one of them happens to be a white drunkard, potential wife beating, whatever.
Talk about poisoning the well.
Right, yeah, true, right. And the other one is a person of a different color who loves Christ. This is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely a no-brainer. But at the same time, I told you kids that marriage has enough challenges of its own. Why would you want to import extra challenges from differences that may be an extra challenge? Won't mean the marriage will fail, but marriage has a lot of challenges. Let's try to give it as much of a chance to succeed as we possibly can. And you know that I said that to you kids when you were growing up.
Yeah.
What's also important is to bear in mind what we're up against. We're fighting cultural Marxism. The Frankfurt School already in the 1920s identified we want to break every tie of blood, soil, race, family, nation, state. This is the goal of cultural Marxism. And as you know, the Frankfurt School moved into Harvard and Hollywood. They basically did a lot of America's culture. So many people today feel pressured to prove that they're not a racist by dating outside, or to prove that they're not. And so that kind of cultural pressure, that is cultural Marxism. That is really the seeds of social suicide, actually, demographic suicide, and that's dangerous. Now, if you are led by the Lord, you make your own free choices. That's fine. But if it's Hollywood making the choices for you, well, that's when we've got to say
that's not so fine.
No, thank you.
Yeah, not really. And see, even one verse that I've tried to work over for a long time. That's Paul's comment there on Mars Hill in Acts 17. He says we're all made of one blood. But it appears he's saying something like he's separated us into different nations,
set the boundaries of the nations,
set the boundaries, so that we would seek God. And I the best I can do with that so far, that's very interesting. Paul there is calling for separate nations in order for us. So what does Hollywood? What do these people know that Peter's talking about? What do they know that we can't figure out? What do these people that want to destroy the nations? What do they know that we can't figure out? What's going on here? It's time to ask ourselves this question.
Yeah.
And I know there are going to be people that are going to say, as a result of this discussion, hey, well now Joel is, whatever name you want to call me. Well, I haven't said a whole lot. I've tried to ask a few questions, and of course, you're not even allowed to ask questions.
Well, I just remember a time in this nation. I mean, like I said before on this on my podcast, that the goal of political correctness is enslavement. That's the goal of political correctness, because the boundary line keeps moving. As you get invited further, the cave is open, and they put a piece of bread out there. You go grab the piece of bread. You think you're good, but now they put another piece of bread further in the cave, and they keep moving the boundary line, so that where you were before is light years away from where you are now. And I remember a time. I even still remember a time growing up. And if you said something that was sort of like something inappropriate about Asians, and someone said, "Hey, that's inappropriate. You're a racist," and if you said, "Well, it's okay. I have a Asian friend, and we hang out all the time," they would say, "Oh, okay. Obviously, you're not a racist, because if you're a racist, you wouldn't have an Asian friend." But now it's gone to you're born into this world, therefore you're a racist. Now it doesn't matter. The definition of racism is varied along whoever wants to use it as a hammer. I've seen people say things like, people of color cannot be a racist, and I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, they define racism differently, and so now it's like a free for all of how do you want to define racism, and now since it's a free for all of how you want to define racism, then you can say anyone is guilty. I could be a racist just for being born.
Well, that's exactly what you are, with some people saying that you're racist because you're white. Now, that's the most odd thing. You talk about, and this is what we said all the time, Luke, that when we throw God out the front door, we're also going to be able to lose our ability to think critically at all. How can you make a statement like if you're not white, you can't be racist, and that not be a racist statement? How can that possibly be?
Because racism doesn't mean racism anymore. It means something else.
I can tell you, because they're talking this way in South Africa, all whites are racists, and no one except a white can be a racist.
Right. But that's not a racist statement.
By that definition, yes, that is about as racist a statement as you could make.
Yeah.
Because how many white people do I know, good friends, members of our mission, who've adopted black children? One of our missionaries adopted 5 black children. He's got 2 white daughters of his own. He's adopted 5 black children. He's called a racist. Why is he called a racist? Because you're not bringing up those children as Zulus or Xhosas. You bring them up as Afrikaans-speaking whites in your home.
Yes. Now we've got the point.
He's bringing up. He's sacrificing. His wife and children are sacrificing a lot, and they're not rich people. I mean, they're a poor family, and they're struggling. But they knew that there are thousands of babies abandoned who've got no one willing to adopt, because unfortunately most black communities are not interested in adopting. And so in South Africa, most black babies get adopted by whites, but those whites are still racist according to the people against them. And we are doing more to help black Christians, our mission, than probably any other mission.
Doesn't count.
America.
It doesn't count.
And yet it doesn't count.
We don't care how many black. It doesn't matter. You're not an official non-racist. You have to be in the club. We don't care.
Right.
We can be sitting around. I remember my mother, your grandmother, Luke, writing a letter, right? And this is in the days of non-discrimination, affirmative action, right? And this was in the days when we had my adopted black grandfather, who you never knew, Dave Waters. He died when he was 22. Lived in our house, right? Lived in our house for like 13 years.
Died when he was 22?
No, died when I was 22.
Okay.
I was one of his pallbearers. Okay. All right. And so, I remember, your grandmother wrote a letter to Ted Kennedy, who was Mr. Inclusive and all kind of stuff. Asked him if he'd ever have a black person staying in his home. She never got an answer. Okay, he's Ted Kennedy. I guess he doesn't have an answer. But this is what I noticed with these people. They're all about preaching for everybody else. You know what? A lot of these people that are preaching all about non-discrimination, they live in the nice white gated neighborhoods.
Yes.
They don't have a lot of minority friends. What's his name? The pastor of Obama's church, Jeremiah Wright.
Yes.
Retired as a millionaire, right? Guess where he moved to? Did he move into the South Side with all his black brothers and sisters? No.
Yeah.
He moved into the White Hood, where he was nice and safe.
Yeah.
Did you notice Kofi Annan, the first black General Secretary of the United Nations, he didn't die in Ghana, his home country, he died in Switzerland.
Oh, what a guy.
Now, when I had to choose a college to study, Baptist Theological College, it was quite simple. Days of apartheid, early 1980s. There was only one place to go. The white Theological College was up in Johannesburg, and the coloured Theological College, you'd call it black, but in South Africa we distinguished in coloured and black. So the black college, I chose to go and study Baptist Theological College at the coloured, so-called coloured college, with mostly, I was a minority. I was riding my motorbike down Klipfontein Road in this area, dodging burning tires, burning vehicles, rocks being thrown on an almost daily basis, getting to college, because I thought if I'm learning to be a missionary in Africa, then I might as well study amongst people of different cultures. And at that time, that earned me visits from the security police, national intelligence, military intelligence, wanting to find out, am I a communist? What's the matter with me? Because back then, if you did that sort of thing, they questioned if you're a communist. Today, if you're against the government, you're racist. You see, so it's intriguing, though, that if people look at a person's track record, you can see what really matters to them. And to me, if a person cares, then what have they done? The mark of true love is sacrifice.
I've said this oftentimes, that the sentimental caring, if you're keeping up points on sentimental caring, I think the priest and the Levite probably had more sentimental caring about the guy. I mean, one guy looks over, one poor guy probably went home and said, I saw this guy laying by the road. You know what? The Good Samaritan, we know he had compassion. The Bible says he had compassion, but it doesn't just say that. We know he had compassion by what he did,
Right.
not by what he said. I have one last question here from one person, a friend of mine. He wants to ask you this question, Peter. He wants to know what resources you would recommend for studying people's population, national boundaries, and immigration. Any ideas there for resources there?
Well, the obvious first place to start is Patrick Johnson's Operation World. Now Jason Mandrick's taken it over. Patrick Johnson did the first 7 editions. Operation World, it is the ultimate missionary intercessory handbook for every single country on earth. And not just every country, almost every nation. Because, as you know, a nation is an ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith. For example, in the Bible, when the Lord Jesus gave the Great Commission, he said, go into all the world and make disciples of every ethne. Every nation, he used the word ethne, from which we get the word ethno-linguistic people group. So the people of Israel, the Hebrews, were Hebrews. Even after 400 years in Egypt, they didn't stop being Hebrews. They didn't become Egyptians. What we've got in America right now is an idea of a geographic accident. That if you're born in America, you're American. Whereas that wasn't the way people used to see it. So, for example, a good friend of mine studied at school with me. He worked as a professor in Hong Kong for many, 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 many years, and his son was born in Hong Kong. His son could not become a Chinese citizen because the Chinese said, you're not Chinese, but I'm born in China. Doesn't matter. You're not Chinese. Now, most countries in the world will think like that. But in America or Europe, that is considered treason, racism, heresy, burn them at the stake. But historically, and forget about historically, missiology-wise, in Missiology 101, they'll teach you a nation is not a country. It is an ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith. By that reasoning, the U.S. Center for World Missions has identified 12,000 nations in the world, not 221. The United Nations is neither united nor nations. It's the largest collection of gangsters with flags in the world, the biggest collection of unelected, mass-murdering dictators, human traffickers, and drug dealers. So this confused people. When people hear America, one nation under God, indivisible. Now, America might have been one nation a long time ago, but you've now become a multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and therefore America is actually, correctly speaking, an empire. I know Americans don't want to hear this, but you are an empire, especially when you're troops in about 100 and something countries in the world.
Absolutely.
So, but a nation and a missionary has to think in terms of how do I reach the Vietnamese boat people in Amsterdam? Just saying there's a church in Amsterdam is not good enough. Am I reaching the Moroccans and the Tunisians in Amsterdam? I've got to think linguistically. I've got to think ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith. Otherwise, I can't do proper missiology. This business of, well, you know, there's just Americans and we've got a church in New York, so that means everyone can be. That is not good missiology, and I'm afraid people are being blinded by this multicultural mumbo-jumbo of, there's only one race, the human race. Well, that's all very well, but the Bible does speak about every race, tongue, nation, family, and the King James Version used the word races. So I know that what we're trying to say, and I understand that sentiment, and that actually we only divide ultimately into saved and lost. But did you notice in Revelation 5 that on the last day, you'll see people of every race, language, nation, and tribe giving thanks to the Lord. So apparently in heaven, it'll all even be identifiable, like every creature. And God didn't just make one, he made many. And that's part of the kaleidoscope of God's creative power. And we shouldn't be seeking to blunt the image of God in the many tribes and nations of the world. As a missionary who's worked in over 37 countries, and I have ministered amongst at least 100 language groups, I could tell you quite a lot of positives of each tribe and different countries and nations where they are better than us in different ways. And so I do understand why there's got to be different tribes and nations. I love the Zulus and the Matabele. I mean, they're some of my best friends and neighbors. But being some of our best friends doesn't necessarily mean that we should intermarry. I mean, I know I'm talking like an African, and they feel that's even stronger than I do. So they say you've got to honor your parents and your grandparents, and that means you must see that their grandchildren are like them. And so this is an African thing. I realize in America today, that's heresy, but just try to understand there's people in other hemispheres, in other continents, facing life and death issues who don't think like Americans think, because we're not being force-fed your media narrative 24/7. And so I think many Americans travel overseas may be shocked to find that a lot of the rest of the world don't think like you, don't think like Sunset Boulevard wants us to think.
I know of a friend of mine who I follow on Facebook, Toby Harmon, has often complained that people call him a racist because even though his wife, I believe, is black and he has, mixed children, and people call him a racist. They call him a racist.
On what basis?
Well, one was they said to him and his wife, you're experiencing white privilege because you're here at the abortion mill protesting abortion, and that's white privilege because you don't have to go to work. Where they're, obviously a hardworking couple and they provide for themselves, but they all take time to go protest them. The other thing he said was he was called a racist, even though his wife is black. I believe she's black anyway. They called him a racist because he was talking about slavery and saying that the abortion Holocaust is similar because they said back in the day that blacks were not human beings and they were property. You could do whatever you want. You could kill them. And he's saying it's the same thing with, I said it's the same thing about babies, and they called me a racist because you're not allowed to talk about slavery. So I mean that's how bad it is.
I've been accused of being anti-Semitic for describing what's going on in abortion today as an abortion holocaust. We've lost 1.5 million babies in our country legally. You've lost about 60 odd million.
Yes.
And apparently, if you speak about killing, targeting a particular group of people and calling it a genocide, I was even called anti-Semitic for writing the book Holocaust in Rwanda. And asked, how is this? Said, because you can only use the term Holocaust referring to the Jews. I said, no. In fact, the term genocide was first coined by the Armenians to describe what happened in 1915 under the Turkish Empire to the Christian Armenians. And I think it's quite racist when people say that a certain ethnic group, owns any form of suffering or targeting.
Yes.
And we've got people angry because we're saying that they're targeting the whites for genocide in South Africa, which they are. They're talking about kill all whites, take away all farms owned by whites, and so on. And you talk about this being a genocide, which according to the professor who's laid out the different principles for genocide, Dr. Gregory Stanton at Mary Washington University, and he's the vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He describes and defines genocide, and he said South Africa has all 9 stages of genocide already. Evidence there. Everything from classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and denial. There's always the denial. Of it. And targeting Christians for genocide as they did in Rwanda, or in Armenia, or in the Soviet Union, or China, or in South Africa, it is genocide, and we should be able to say it. But unfortunately, today we've got such a war on free speech that any free speech that somebody doesn't like, some leftist, they call it hate speech.
Yeah, well, and just to be sure, you don't deny that the Holocaust happened. You just think it was far less than what they said.
Goodness me, I wasn't there.
Right.
I can't document everything that was done there. I've certainly heard all kinds of eyewitness testimonies of people who suffered in Germany, who suffered in Russia, who suffered after the war, who suffered during the war. And there's so much more to the story of what Christians have been suffering and what Jewish people have been suffering worldwide. So, no, if people want to say Peter Hammond denies the Holocaust, well, I've written a book on the Holocaust in Rwanda just for starters.
Right.
And I'm warning about the genocide being advocated for people in South Africa. And I am against any of these kinds of targeting of believers or any group of people. And for that matter, I would stand up and defend whether it's Muslims or Buddhists or Jews, whoever's being targeted. We must speak up for them. We must be good neighbors. We must do to others we want to be done to. We must love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yes. Well, that's our interview with Dr. Peter Hammond. Hopefully he answered a lot of questions. I know that Dad and I have come across the arguments for kinism before, and this isn't the first time, but a lot of interesting conversation. Glad we could clear the air on some things for you there, Dr. Hammond, because for a long time people were just saying stuff and nobody was really given the other side of the story, though a lot of us knew there was. Hopefully this will give the other side of the story.
To those who care. To those who care.
Yeah, to those who care.
To those who don't, it'll do nothing. But anyway.
Dad and I probably aren't going to walk out of this room as kinists. I don't think that'll ever happen. But thanks anyway, Dr. Hammond, for your answers.
I wrote a book on this very phenomenon with 8 other people called Character Assassins. Over 300 pages looking at character assassins, dealing with ecclesiastical tyrants and terrorists. And I think we're living in an age of character assassination. As you can see, every time you have a pro-life justice being proposed for the Supreme Court, just for example.
Yeah.
But it's a phenomenon we see in the Bible. But remember what Jesus says, woe unto you when all men speak well of you.
Yes.
And there's so many warnings about being deceived. So as Christians, let's do our research and also look at the track record of the people criticizing. And you can always tell the difference between constructive criticism and destructive criticism.
Yes.
Constructive criticism comes from a friend, a coach, a teacher, one who's on your side, one who wants you to succeed. Destructive criticism comes from somebody who wants to see you fail.
Mm-hmm. Even Jesus had Judas.
Even Jesus had a Judas.
That's right. All right. Thanks again, Dr. Hammond. Dad, thanks for being on the show. Hopefully we will see you guys all next time. Have a good one.